line of the price of crude oil, and this is impacting the currencies in Arab countries. We're going to continue this subject, and then a much lighter subject, looking at the lessons from Surah Al-Baqarah. We should be at about ayat number 70 if you're going to be with us. Short break, and we're back, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to Hada tonight. This is our second segment of the program, where our subject tonight for segment 2 is a pan-Arab trade. We're looking at trade between the different Arab countries, and we're going to be talking about a very important aspect relevant to the current direction and the situations that Arab countries are faced with. This is just a part, but a very significant part of the Muslim Ummah. About 1/4 of all Muslims are Arabs, very significant number, between 450 to 500 million people. So we're going to be talking with Professor emaad.muhanna, Professor of Political Science, Strategic Studies, to talk about this. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Can we start, Professor, by, to make sure everyone follows us well, to talk about trade agreements, what kinds, how do economics people define the different types of trade agreements that countries enter?
Well, the world has identified all in all, five trade agreement types. The first one starts, let's apply it to, for example, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, so to make it easier for respected viewers. The first type is called the free zone.
Okay.
Where in that first type you remove the trade barriers. That's the first level. The second level, the two countries remove the trade barrier and implement internal economic policies. So the first trade barrier, the first level, we join the two countries, remove the trade barriers, no tariffs. Second level up, implement internal economic policies as well as removing trade barriers. Third level, remove trade barriers, implement internal economic policies, and implement external economic policies. So if one country has a relationship with country C, then the other country will trade with that country as well.
I see.
And if there's a bad relationship with one country, the other one shouldn't trade with it as well. The third one, again, is removing trade barriers, implement internal economic policies, and external economic and trade policies. The fourth level is full economic integration, where you would have unified currency, you have unified central bank, unified economic policies internally, externally, even the international trade agreements and customs. The fifth level, no country or no group of countries ever reached, which is full political integration. So that's like a total unity.
Erasing the political boundaries?
Exactly, and they become with under one president or one king or one prince.
So the unions that we see are more like the level 4 type?
The level 4, but even if we start level 1 and 2, it's still beneficial, but the Arabs never actually started anything. If you look at the European Union, that's level 4, because that's economic integration, internal economic policies, external economic policies, as well as one central bank.
So they have a common currency?
Common currency.
They can move freely with without visas?
The currency can be used anywhere in the European Union. Internal and external economic policies, one central bank, one parliament.
So if European Union doesn't do trade, let's say with Saudi Arabia or Egypt,
then the rest won't trade. Okay? If they enter the agreement, they will have to adhere to the rules of the Union. But moving from there, if we look at examples, the first level in terms of removing trade barriers, still the Arabs still starting with that. The Arab market, or the pan-Arab trade, and was announced in 1964. In 1965, and it was signed as the Joint Arab Market and Trade Agreement. It was signed in 1964. In 1965, Egypt, Syria, Iraq joined. 12 years later, another 3 countries joined, and that basically included the number of other countries like the Emirates, Libya, and Morocco. But still, the GCC, or the Gulf Cooperation Council, is the main organization that governs economic and trade agreements within the Arab
This is
world.
the economic engine of the
Exactly,
Arab
and it's more powerful than the Arab League itself because of the amount of resources, the amount of trade. So in 1964, it was established, announced, 65 3 countries. 12 years later, we've seen another 4 countries or 3 countries joined and stayed like that until about 1998, where it was redeveloped. Here it became under the Arab League, and then started to establish some sort of committees for economic cooperation, the military cooperation, the cultural cooperation, social cooperation, and the Arab League started to take basically part in that. But it was actually never implemented on the ground. The first level in terms of free zone, it's here and there, bits and pieces of trades and services. But if you look at other regions, you find NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. You find Mercosur in South America. You find the COMESA in Africa. You find PATA, the Pacific Asia trade agreement. So there is a number of trade agreements that are very successful, and the Arabs could actually learn from them.
So to date, the only thing that has happened is creating a joint market.
Joint market, it has been always the title of the whole agreement, but it was actually never done on levels as it was anticipated. Because the level 4, if you look at the actual plan and the articles that were written and signed in 1964, the articles basically state that over the years they will integrate the Arab economies.
Okay.
But it never happened.
It hadn't happened.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about the GAFTA, the Greater Arab Free Trade Agreement.
Yeah.
Or is that correct? Agreement or area?
Yeah.
Is that somehow? How does that differ from the?
It still falls under the joint market.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying. You find a lot of agreements, but nothing actually on the ground level
What is
works.
stopping the agreements from moving forward?
It's a political will, and again, the ties between, and we probably spoke about that in different episodes, where you have different Arab leaders have trade ties with other parts of the world, and they don't want to compromise that.
I see.
So this is, again, the difficulty. So is the GCC, the Gulf Council, will dissolve itself if the Arab League takes control? I don't think they will be happy to do that. You've got that on one side, and so again, it's a competition. So you're going to have a council that includes 5 or 6 countries under the Arab League joint market, or the Pan-Arab trade that includes 23 countries. So who's going to be in control?
I want to ask a historical example. Egypt. Signing the historic Camp David peace accords,
Yep.
It was not only peace, but it also included
That's right.
an economic
Trade.
aspect of
Yep.
aid, to Egypt,
Yes.
to the tune
That was
of,
part of 1979, the Camp David you're talking about. isn't it?
yeah. That also included an economic aspect, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
and so what?
aid and the economic cooperation, and that wasn't good for Egypt, because and here it becomes a very valid point why we should actually have the Pan-Arab trade.
Because if we stand alone, in the case of Egypt in '79,
Then they will support you, the Arabs. But more than that, if you look at the trade agreements between or among the Arab countries, it doesn't exceed 10% of total Arab trade. It's only 10%. The rest is going to the rest of the world. So if you're going to have a proper Pan-Arab trade, you're going to have to increase that 10% to probably 80 or 90. And that's quite difficult, because a lot of Arab countries have already ties with other states and regions. In terms of why economically we should have what we call regional trade bloc versus globalization. The problem with globalization is that it creates agreements worldwide. All countries have agreements with each other. But the winner here is the country that has basically industrialized setup or a platform that basically exports, and the other countries have nothing to export to them. And this is exactly the case that is happening in Egypt. Egypt exports to United States worth of about $1.5 billion. We receive from United States equal to about $10 billion worth of goods. China is the same. You've got $9 billion in trade deficit with China, $8 billion trade deficit with Russia, and about or $8.5 billion trade deficit with the United States.
So this is what puts American canned tomatoes on the markets in Egypt and other countries.
Exactly. So if you have a regional trade bloc, then Egypt will rely on the Arabs will rely on Egypt, and vice versa. And that becomes basically a platform or a backup for you, so you don't have to trade with countries that are strong economically. Because the trade becomes one way. If you look at countries, let's take one of the poor countries, like Zambia or Burundi. What does Burundi have to give to United States in terms of trade?
Alone, as opposed to with a bloc.
Exactly.
It's much stronger.
Exactly. But here, Burundi will receive a lot of goods coming from the United States. And that causes, number one, trade deficit. Number two, loss of a dollar.
Right.
Because that's what we talked about last
before,
time.
Yeah. Which
in
drops
terms
the
of
local
why
currency.
Egypt is losing its dollars. Because Egypt imports 75% of its goods and services, and 56% of its food.
But it's so crystal clear, Professor. Why is it that the countries continue, especially developing countries, continue to try and stand alone? Why? I mean, obviously it's in their interest
because it's a political will. If you look at situations, and we'll give an example that I've seen in Zimbabwe. Mugabe has always had ties with United Kingdom in terms of aid, etc. But when they stopped the aid, he turned against them, and then he started to attack the white Europeans that living in Zimbabwe and destroyed his own land. So in the end, why don't you, Mugabe, basically use the land to develop your own country? And it's exactly the same. Why would Mubarak and the rest of the Arab leaders get in bed, as you like, if you like, with large states that will never benefit you? We call it in political economy the dependence of the North on the South. They use us in the South, as South means all the Middle East going south, as farms to get the material, manufacture it in Europe, and then return it back. So the Egyptian cotton is the best in the world. We import it as raw material. We receive it, T-shirts for 5,000 and 10,000 pounds. That's the difference. So here, what we're looking at in terms of the Arab joint market or the pan-Arab trade is to maximize the economic cooperation to ensure that the wealth of this nation remains in the nation. The same thing can apply to oil. At this point, how many refineries you have in the Middle East?
I'm sorry, I want to ask you, Professor, if the bottom line is selfishness.
Or corruption.
Meaning, this is what I'm saying. So an individual leader is more interested in him and his...
exactly, but it doesn't have a long vision. And just to give some of the examples, you found what did Gaddafi do in Libya over the past 45 years? He's been in power? Nothing. You've got high illiteracy rate, you've got people displaced. Egypt, 30 years.
But he's bringing in American entertainers to provide a private entertainment for him and his family.
But that's exactly. So here it is what we, and we raised that point last time, is that we need to use the financial resources right, because tomorrow there will be no oil. So you will be left with whatever you managed to develop over the past 50 years out of that oil money. When the oil is finished, what have you left with? If you developed your own nation culturally, if you developed your own nation educationally, if you developed your own nation politically, economically, infrastructure, this is what you've got. South Africa is one of the great countries that I love because the white South Africans never had the intention, despite the apartheid, but they actually built South Africa. And that is the difference between the situation in South Africa and other parts where the white Europeans basically put their hands, like in India or in Egypt. They never developed. But in South Africa, they developed. And the reason I'm saying that is that when you needed to bring the previously disadvantaged groups, you could have an infrastructure. You had a lot of universities. They had 7 universities in the top 500. So they had a great education, a great political system, economic system. So it's easy to pick people and put them on the right level.
Yeah, so in other words, you can't have the city of Johannesburg giving a 6-meter-high bronze statue to Ramallah if there hadn't been development there in the first place.
Exactly.
I want to also ask you about Palestine, because there is a boycott that the Arab League talked about last year. There was a meeting of the Arab League to try and get Arab businessmen to stop doing business with Israelis. Despite the boycott, despite the obvious human rights crisis, there's still individuals.
This is a political corruption, and I'll give you the clear example of the quiz agreement. The quiz agreement, basically, Egypt signed that agreement with Israel to try to get to the trade with the United States, even though we're losing on both fronts. United States, as I told you, because it's one-way trade, we don't have much to give to United States. So all we're doing is just importing. Because the problem with WTO, World Trade Organization, as soon as you sign, you're obliged to open your borders. That's the problem.
Free trade.
Free trade. But with the regional trade bloc, you are in control. You know, Egypt can say to Saudi Arabia, look, we're going to have to slow down because now I've got a trade deficit with you. You're sending me goods for 10 billion, I'm sending you goods for 5 billion. So I've got 5 billion deficit. But Saudi Arabia can do the same. But with the WTO, you can't do that. As soon as you close your borders, they will close their borders for your stuff as well. So you're going to be the loser. And that's exactly what happened here in Egypt particularly, and all Egyptians know about the cotton. When Egypt stopped the Greek cotton to come to Egypt because it competes with the Egyptian cotton, also in terms of the price, they stopped importing, Europe stopped importing the Egyptian potatoes.
Because one of its members
has suffered. And this is what you need to have in a trade bloc. And believe me, whatever you want to have in terms of military cooperation is going to happen, because economy builds politics. Economy builds armies. Armies never build economies. And we've seen the Middle East that's been ruled by army officers never make economy. So economies make politics and make armies. If you're strong economically, you will have the finances and you will be able to build a strong army.
So you're making a case for civilian government.
Civilian governments, because if you have a military that is focused primarily on military focus, you're going to be driving your resources towards one direction, but not towards economic development, not towards education, not towards cultural development. And this has become, you're going to be falling short on that. And on a long run, you're going to be a nation that is carrying the latest weapon, but here, the brain doesn't think.
Yeah, about the larger goal, the larger picture. All right, I'd like to come back to the lack of political will to implement and create a, you said that there's an economic bloc among Arab countries, but it's not being implemented.
Yes.
So how do we encourage leaders, change government? How do we make the change?
To answer the question, we need to go back to 1967 up to 73 war, and the stand that was taken by King Faisal. And in terms of Arab bloc, he could stop the oil flow into Europe to put pressure on the Europeans, to put pressure on the United States. That's the bloc. And the reason I'm going back that time, if you look at the New Middle East, the New Middle East was first introduced in 1954, and it was developed over the years, But when they came to the 70s, two people had to be gone, King Faisal and President Sadat. Because these two people had the political will you're referring to.
Both in Egypt.
Yeah, the Saudi Arabia and Egypt, because they both had the will to get the Arabs together and use oil, as we were talking last time, use oil as a strategic weapon. Here I'm referring to the new modern wars. The new modern wars, you talking about economic resources that you use. So oil is a strategic weapon, yet it's going down now 30-something, yet we're still supplying the world. When oil is finished, we're going to be faced with a scenario that we are going to be importing oil from Europe because they have the stock. United States has the stock. So we're going to keep giving them at low prices. 20, 30, 50 years down the line, we're going to be importing that oil back.
I failed to ask you a very important question last week when you were with us, talking about how there's this relationship between oil and dollar.
Yes.
I didn't ask you what's driving the price down of oil in the first place. Is it just production?
Slow economic development.
Globally?
Globally, yeah. Slower economic development. United States alone uses 25%.
Of the global oil?
Yeah, and then followed by China and Japan and Germany. So there is a slowness in that. Economic slowed down coming from 2008. We're still suffering.
Yeah.
So that is affecting the oil prices. On top of that, there is more oil that's been discovered in the United States. So the supply is a lot more than what was there before. Again, the entering of Iran, and we refer to that after the agreement, nuclear agreement 5+1. So they already entered the supply field. And we talked about why OPEC doesn't want to slow down the supply so Iran doesn't seize that opportunity and fill up the gap. So it is a lot of politics in there. And unfortunately, we're always affected by politics. Political will, if you put the example, the scenario of King Faisal and President Sadat and what happened to them, and conspiracy on Saudi Arabia and Egypt during the 70s, you will know why the following leaders never really knock the door again, because they know they will be threatened. So what you need is strong leaders that fear nobody but God. They will be able to do it.
So you're saying King Faisal of Saudi Arabia and
King Sadat, President Sadat,
President Sadat
yeah.
of Egypt, they were willing to take a strong stand in terms economically.
Yes, because they used oil as a strategic weapon. So therefore, the cooperation between the two countries was very close.
To cut off
any future plan or a vision for closeness. They two, they understood. They were very close as in personality. So they could understand the conspiracies. Even the plan of the new Middle East. President Sadat saw that in the White House. He saw there's a map on the wall in the White House, and they deliberately showed to Sadat. They wanted to get his reaction. But he was a deep man. He never reacted. He never commented. He made like he's never seen it.
The map showed a carving up of...
no, it showed the new division of the new Middle East.
Yeah.
The 56 countries into 88. You know, Saudi Arabia is divided into 4, Egypt is divided into 4, etc. And when he came back, he asked for an urgent meeting with King Faisal and informed him. So they were always planning the Arab,
counter-offensive.
Exactly, and the whole Arab plan was set up between these two, and they basically became a threat to the Western colonial powers that want to get the countries divided. And if you look at from the 1975, the assassination of King Faisal, and then 81, President Sadat, you could see that the focus was primarily on destroying 5 things in these countries. And I like the respective viewers to try to memorize them. Number 1 is destruction of culture. So people don't know how to talk. They forget about the religion. They forgot the language. they don't read the Quran, so you culturally become lost.
Lose a historical sense of
it's
self.
a total, exactly, it's a total cultural erosion. Number two, education. So you find that the education system, for example, in the 70s, Egypt was number 34 in terms of rank worldwide. Now, Egypt is number 132. So, culture, education. Number three, health. When you have people sick, no medication, there's corruption in the, in the medical field in terms of medicine manufacturing, or even corruption in education, so the doctor is not qualified enough. Whichever way, so you find your systems are totally corrupt. So no culture, no education, no health systems. Number four, corruption in administrative government. And here you find that a country with no culture, with no education, with no health, and with no management, you find public monies are always lost, no proper plans for the future, etc. The fifth one was the armies, and they got to that from the end of the 80s. Iraq fighting Iran, and then when he's finished with Iran, come and get him in 1990. They don't give you time to actually rest, because why they don't give us time? Because they always plan 100 years in advance. We don't. Because they destroyed, if we remember, they destroyed our culture and our education, so we don't know how to plan. So we always act surprisingly, is that there is a problem in Iraq. So they got Iraq, and then they wanted him, they were pushing him to get into Saudi Arabia. They got basically Syria, so you've got the corners all destroyed. Total control over the GCC countries in terms of what they can do and what they can develop militarily.
The traps that you talked about, creating traps.
Exactly. And then you got Libya. They wanted to get to Egypt in 2011. And that's how they plan it. And they don't stop.
All right, so we're, this year, there's going to be a new U.S. president.
Yes.
And it looks like, as of today, that Donald Trump is going to be the nominee for the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Chances are that if Hillary Clinton continues to accumulate, that she'll be the
Remember when we
Democratic
discussed
nominee. So the question, the question is, the next step in the plan for the new Middle East.
If respected viewers and we could together can actually remember what we talked about that time, we said that it depends on the situation in the Middle East. If United States want to gain more friendly atmosphere and make more friends, they're going to go for Hillary
Democratic,
Clinton. And if they want to get into weapons and total military intervention,
dividing more countries,
exactly, they will get to
the Republican
Donald Trump. I don't think it's very clear at this point, because what they needed is Egypt. If Egypt, and their election is in October, isn't it?
It's in November.
In November. So depends, and mark my words, if Egypt doesn't go peacefully in the next 3 to 5 months, peacefully, and you get a lot of trouble, political troubles in Egypt, Donald Trump will be the president, because they want him to get and finish it, because that's the last step for the new Middle East.
Wait, let me make sure, this is an important point. You're saying that if Egypt doesn't continue to cruise along...
If Egypt is cruising along and peacefully, and political and economic conflicts are sorted out, and that particular point with the whole plan depends on President Sisi, on how he managed the country. Because at this point, you've got problems in journalists, you've got a problem with the youth, you know, there's a lot of issues. But what I'm saying is, United States government, political system, and the people act upon a mission. So the mission of the next president still in the cooking.
I see.
So if Egypt continues to cruise peacefully, and the relationship among the Arabs are getting closer, then you will need a sweet tongue, Hillary Clinton. If Egypt doesn't go well in terms of political conflict around President Sisi or the government or the whole political system, if there's a crack, Donald Trump will be the president. Because United States will be totally worried if there's a crack. We're totally talking neutrally, you know, away from being an Egyptian or whatever, and we analyzing a situation. If there is a political crack in Egypt, then United States will be absolutely worried that Russia will be getting into Egypt as an alliance. So they don't want to step, they want to step there first. Because none of the two superpowers can lose Egypt.
So
that's the
we've
whole
had
center.
We've had three this year. We've had three stories that got international attention. This Italian doctoral student,
Yeah,
the King Salman deal for the two islands,
that's right.
and then most recently the journalist. The political opponents to Sisi are looking for any opportunity.
No, Sisi made a number of errors, and we can name them. And the error here, not the decision. The error came because of the haste in taking the decision. It's the timing, not the decision itself. Number one, in terms of the gas fields with Israel and Cyprus, he withdrew from large part in the Mediterranean. That was number one. Number two, he signed for Renaissance Dam to Ethiopia. And that becomes a problem because it affects Egypt's water.
Is it proven that it's going to reduce Egypt's quota?
They're going to be storing money or you know,
water behind the wall?
Water for 7 years. So it definitely is going to affect. And it's already been shown in different parts of the Nile, where the land is higher, it's shallow, it's started to show.
I see.
Irrespective of that, even if it doesn't affect, here you needed an endorsement of Parliament. That's what I'm saying. It's not the decision particularly, it's the timing and the procedures. You needed the Parliament to endorse it on the gas fields with Cyprus and Israel. That's number one. Number two, the signature of the Renaissance Dam and the signature of the two islands. Those are the three areas. On top of that, you've got a number of issues like the journalists. You've got about 55,000 youth in prisons and the rest of it. So the situation here is difficult for him, and getting a final answer on the U.S. Presidency, I think both of them will depend on what happens in Egypt, not in Syria.
All right, we've got about 5 minutes left, Professor. We've talked about some very important things related to the economies in Arab countries. Of course, economics doesn't stand alone by itself. It's related to politics, to military.
The society and cultures. Under the Arab League, particularly from the 80s, they started to develop a number of committees, as we said before, on culture, on societies, cooperation, on women, on children, on human rights. So there's a number of committees that basically depends and also affects the economic cooperation. But why is the pan-Arab trade can be successful, and why do we actually need it? We need it, number one, to reduce dependency on a dollar. Because when we talked about the relationship among the Arab countries, we said that we can have a parallel currency. We could have like an Arab pounds or an Arab dinar or a dollar. And then every country can put $1 billion in reserve for that particular currency, and we use it for trade. Just use it for trade. Slowly, you're going to find it growing, because you're talking about 40% of world natural resources in that area. So it's going to grow.
There's an Arab monetary fund.
Yes, there's an Arab monetary fund, but it's not active. Because at this point you don't have a currency. So we could start with a parallel one, not like the European where you can use it as a main currency. We don't want to reach that phase yet, because some countries will refuse, like Kuwait, for example. The Kuwaiti dinar equals about 29 pounds. so Egyptian pounds. So it will be a problem for some countries, but we can have a parallel one. So besides the Saudi riyal, you can have an Arab dinar where you can just use it for trade. That's number one. Number two, you need to have some sort of cooperation, closer cooperation among universities and research institutes to develop. Businesses and trades where we can trade, the Arabs trade with each other and reduce dependency on the European cooperation and even with Israel. So why are these countries or these companies trade with Israel? It's purely political will and probably political corruption in some cases.
Yeah.
In fact, if you talk about Hussein Salim, for example, the one that established he and Mubarak, the Eastern Mediterranean company, that were exporting gas to Israel. He's purely Egyptian, but yet he was gaining his profit from Israel. The quiz agreement is actually contributed to the trade deficit of Egypt. We receive goods and services from the quiz countries close to $1 billion. We exporting to them about $200 million. So
ECOWAS, the Economic Community of Western, is that what you're saying?
No. The quiz is Israel, Egypt, United States.
Okay.
It's not the African one. This is really what we need to focus on. In terms of resources, you have whatever you need. And the basic principles to build a proper pan-Arab economies: land, labor, and capital. You've got the capital, you've got the labor, and you've got the land. So you need nothing.
Make the change
Exactly.
before the reserves continue to plummet.
Exactly. And this I'm saying, and that's why I deliberately had, needed to go back to King Faisal, because the only two that had the political will and the vision were King Faisal and President Sadat. From that time, nobody could actually get in. All you can say during the 90s and the 2000s, nothing happened.
So the main thing is a problem of leadership being corrupt and selfish.
Exactly.
Getting in the way that's obstructing the forward movement of the whole
in few seconds, how it works. Number one, the political leaders will sign an agreement. Number one, and you already have that in place. Number two, these trade agreements will be translated into policies. So we put documents. This is what we're going to do, and over a number of years. Number three, these policies will be translated into strategies implemented by the governments. Here it becomes a command or an order. You have to do it.
Yeah.
But if governments are not doing it, it's because it's never done on top. So it's just a piece of paper that we signed, but you never give your instructions to your government. I never give my instructions to my government, and nothing happens.
All right, Professor, thank you so much.
We need new leaders with new visions.
Yeah, inshallah, may we have this, inshallah. Thank you so much for being with us, Professor. We've reached the end of segment 2, our discussion on political status of pan-Arab trade. We'd like to take a short break, come back for Surah Al-Baqarah. Inshallah, we're going to be looking at ayat 70. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to the third and final segment of the program. We are going to be talking about a much lighter subject.